This is a day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. I forgot to grab the clicker. Have to have my clicker. Well, it's good to see everybody here this morning, especially our visitors from all the way out in the valley. But it's good to have everybody here. We do have some that are traveling, and they were missed, and we look forward to having them back, and some that are going to be traveling this afternoon for the week. So remember those in your prayers as well. If you need to communicate to somebody, you must talk to them in a language that they will understand. If you're going to talk to me, it needs to be in English. If you talk to me in French, I'm not going to understand a word that you say. We have a couple of guys in one of the houses that I maintain who are deaf, and they speak in sign language. And I know very little bit of sign language, and so I try to learn a little bit, and so I can communicate with this one guy at least, through the day, because otherwise he has to write everything down. But I still can't communicate with him, and I've had to work in his room a couple of times, and it's kind of awkward, because I find myself, the other day I was going into his room, and he was going out, and I was yelling at him, and it's like, he doesn't understand me. He doesn't hear me, and so you got to be careful. If you talk to me about carpentry, I'm going to understand pretty much everything that you have to say, because I've been a carpenter, and I've made things and built things and all that, and so I understand pretty much a lot of the carpentry terms, and I've been around construction a lot, so I understand it. But if you were to talk to me about microbiology or rocket science, I'm going to be lost. I know that microbiology deals with tiny things, and rocket science builds with sending rockets into the sky. But beyond that, I don't understand it. Okay? I don't know if you've ever watched the show, Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader, with Jeff Foxworthy. And one time we watched it, and there was a rocket scientist on there. And he failed. And you have to get up at the end. If you fail, and the fifth grader smarter than you, then you've got to stand up in front of the camera and say that the fifth grader was smarter than you. And he gets up there, and it was just epic. He says, "I am a rocket scientist, and I'm not smarter than a fifth grader." Because whenever we talk about something, it's like, well, it's not rocket science. It's not rocket science. But that rocket scientist had to get up there and say that he wasn't as smart as a fifth grader. So to me, it was just fitting. But whenever we see Jesus talking to people in the Bible, he always talks to them in a way that they will understand it. He uses terms that they will understand. And sometimes they don't understand it at that point, as we're going to see today, but it's something that he's trying to get across to them, and he does it in a way that they will understand. And a great example of this is found in the simple phrase that we're going to look at this morning in John 6, when Jesus told the Jews that I am the bread of life. This is a phrase that we might not understand, or we might interpret it the wrong way, especially for a non-Christian who doesn't understand the idea of the bread of life. So what is Jesus referring to with this phrase, I am the bread of life? Like most of his teaching, he refers back to the Old Testament, doesn't he? And we see that for it is written. And that's what he's doing here. So before we turn to John 6, all those that were already flipping there, I know it, I'm sorry. Let's go to Exodus 6 first, or Exodus 16, and look at that and see where this phrase comes from. I heard people flipping their Bible to John 6, and it's like, I'm going to get you. So go to Exodus 16. The children of Israel have just been released from their Egyptian captors and have fled. And I guess you could state it that they escaped between the waters of the Red Sea, because as we know, they passed on dry land. Now in verse 1 of Exodus 16, and they, the children of Israel, journeyed from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month, after they departed from the land of Egypt. Then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The children of Israel, as we know, were a complaining people, weren't they? They spent 40 years complaining about one thing or another, and it was fitting that they started off their 40 years of wandering in the desert by complaining to Moses and to Aaron. Then in verse 3, and the children of Israel said to them, "Oh, what we had died, or that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, and when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger. Never mind the slavery, never mind the beatings and the abuse that they took by the Egyptians. They have already forgotten that. They cried out to God to deliver them from their Egyptian owners. But here they are, just a few days later, complaining to God that the bread and the meat that they had in Egypt at least kept them alive. And here you freed us, but you have brought us out to the desert to starve us." Going on in verse 4, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Behold, I will rain bread from heaven to you.'" I don't know about you, but have you ever thought about that the manna that God rained down on the Israelites was actually loaves of bread? That's what I always thought of, because that's how I see bread. That's how I get bread, is in a loaf. Okay? But we're going to look at this in detail as we go down through this chapter and find out exactly what it was that rained down. Continuing on, "And the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. And it shall be on the 6th day that they shall prepare what they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily." We are studying the Sabbath. We just started it last week on Wednesday night, and we were talking about when the Sabbath came into being, and I had stated that it was after the Ten Commandments. Well, after getting to here, it was actually during this time period. He doesn't call it the Sabbath at this point, but he says the 6th day. Okay, so he's starting to kind of get them into the habit of what it is that he's going to be talking about. So if we go down, again, we will see this down in verses 22 and 23. Notice that God is giving the Israelites the law to see if they will obey him or not. Do they? Let's find out. Dropping down to verse 11. "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I have heard the complaints of the children of Israel. Speak to them, saying, At twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. And you shall know that I am the Lord your God. So it was that quail came up in the evening and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay all around the camp." The dew laid all around the camp. We don't have dew up here in the Northwest because we're pretty much a dry climate. But where I'm from, down in the Southeast, we have dew every single morning when you wake up. And it can be really thick at times. It just drowns everything. Most people down there in the Southeast don't have sprinkler systems, because God waters it every single night with the dew that comes in. Okay? So up here, when we talk about dew, it's kind of a foreign topic, okay? Because we don't have it. But what is this dew that lays all around the camp, and what is its importance? Continuing on in verse 14, we read, "And when the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a small round substance, as fine as frost on the ground." Now we do understand what frost is up here. We do get that. "So when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, What is it? What is this small round substance that we see on the ground? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, This is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat." Now, depending on how you look at the meaning of manna, it's different depending on where you look at. Just like a lot of things that you read on the internet and with Bible scholars when they talk about the verses. And I looked at several different commentaries, and just about every single one of them had a different meaning to what manna is. One commentary stated that manna is a vegetable bread. And that was one way of looking at it. Another one stated that it is commonly derived from man, M-A-N, as an expression of surprise. What is it? That was manna. Or that it was more probably derived from manan, M-A-N-A-N, which is a meaning of allotment, or to give an allotment or to give a gift, which would be fitting to what this is as manna. It was a gift from God. But another one says that manna means, what is it? And I kind of like that meaning because that's what they said when they saw this for the first time. What is it? Well, it's manna. But again, the manna was covered by the frost, and it was just a small, round substance. Verse 16, this is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Let every man gather it, the manna, according to each one's need. 1 omer for each person, according to the number of persons. Let every man take for those who are in his tent, and his tent only. Then the children of Israel did so and gathered some more and some less. So when they measured it by omers, he who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. Every man had according to each man's needs. So the Israelites did what they were told to. They went out and gathered an omer of the manna. Some of them, of course, trying to get more and want to make sure that they had enough, they'd get their omer measurement cup, and it would maybe be overflowing. And then some might just get a scoop of it, fill it up as they went along, and didn't fill up their omer cup. But whenever they went to make the bread, and we'll get into that in a minute, if they had too much, it was just right. And if they didn't have enough, it was just right. Again, the Lord is taking care of them. He's giving them what they need. And again, he is testing them to see if they're going to do what he tells them to do. But the thing to notice is that nobody went lacking. And in verse 19, and Moses said, let no one leave any of it till morning. In other words, you have your omer per person of manna. You use that omer of manna today. You don't save any of it for tomorrow. Verse 20, notwithstanding, they did not heed Moses, which means they did not heed God who was testing them, remember? But some of them left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them, so they gathered it every morning, every man according to his need. And when the sun became hot, what was ever left out in the field, whatever was left in the wilderness that they did not collect, when the sun came out, it melted away. That means the people could not go out there later and gather up more and be greedy about it. Okay? So God has this all straightened out and how it's going to be. You go out there and you collect an omer for each person, and you use that today, and you don't hoard any of it, and you don't get more than what you need, and once everybody's collected it, it's gone. In other words, God is going to take care of them. He's going to take care of all their needs, and we'll see more about that later. Verse 22, and so it was on the 6th day that they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. Then he said to them, this is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is the Sabbath, rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today, and boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until morning. 2 things I want to glean from verse 23. The Lord is introducing the Israelites to the Sabbath rest. The 7th day would to be holy unto the Lord. The second thing we see here is that we see here that they either baked the manna or baked the manna, or they boiled it. So they were doing something with this manna. And again, some people, when you read the book, they say that the tiny white substance was the bread. Some of them, when you read here, it says that they baked it or they boiled it. and exactly what they were doing with it, we don't know. Okay? But the point here is Moses is telling them to tell the people, if you're going to bake it, you bake it on the sixth day. If you're going to boil it, you boil it on the sixth day, and you prepare it for the Sabbath. You don't do any of the baking or boiling on the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a day of rest. Now, if they kept it on Friday and they tried to keep it, remember, it would spoil. The worms would get into it and it would stink. But on the sixth day, what they made for the Sabbath, it would not spoil. The worms would not get into it. So we see here again, the Lord is telling them what to do and how to do it. And if they disobey him by trying to keep it to the next day, it's spoiled. But on the Sabbath, he keeps it good for them to have for that day. So the Israelites ended up obeying God, and they kept the Sabbath. And then we drop down to verse 31. Now, what do you think of when you hear the word manna? Do you think that God, again, was dropping loaves of bread down from heaven? And that's what I always thought of. But this is what it actually looks like when you look at the white coriander seeds. And they're real tiny. This might make them look like a peanut size, but they're actually real tiny. The manna, the bread that, let me go up to verse 31. And the house of Israel called its name manna. And it was like white coriander seed, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. The manna, the bread that God supplied, looked something like this white coriander seed pictured here. Some scholars claim that this manna was the bread, and as we read here, it tasted like wafers made with honey, so it was a sweet bread. Other scholars claim that they took the manna and baked it, and that's what we just read in the scriptures. Of course, that begs the question of what else did they use and mix with this to make bread out of it, because I know you don't just take flour and make bread. You have to mix other things with it. And again, we don't know what it was and how they did it. We just read where they baked it or they boiled it. So it could be that you could crush this up and it would make a bread. We don't know. But again, this was bread coming from God. It was enough to nourish them, and they ate it. However they cooked it and whatever they wanted, however they did it, we don't know for sure. But God was supplying them with meat, water, and manna to sustain them while they were in the desert. So I'm going to assume that this manna was the bread as God describes it as. In verse 23 said they could bake it or boil it, but it is assuming that they didn't have anything to mix it with. Again, I'm stating that. Exodus 16. Have you ever leftovers from Thanksgiving? And after 2 or 3 days, that Tom turkey is getting old, maybe 3 or 4 days, you're looking for some bologna or something to have instead, because you're just tired of having that turkey and dressing. Well, if we drop down to verse 35, and the children of Israel ate manna 40 years, until they came to an inhabited land. They ate manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. So the children of Israel woke up every morning and collected their portion of the manna and ate it day in and day out for 40 years. Do you think they ever got tired of eating manna? I mean, we get tired of turkey and dressing after 3 or 4 days. But imagine 40 years of eating the same bread. Let us rejoice and be glad in this day that the Lord has made. And let's rejoice in everything that he has given us and blessed us with. It might not be something that we like, but it's a day the Lord has given us, and we need to rejoice. Remember, God is taking care of you every day of your life. It is up to you to make the most of it, or to be unhappy and complain about what the Lord has blessed you with, as the Israelites will do after a while about manna. Now, we talked about an omer. The Israelites were to gather 1 omer of manna for each person per day, except for on the 6th day, where they would gather 2 omers per person. So what is an omer? Well, verse 36 tells us that an omer is 1/10 of an ephah. Now you know what an omer is. It's 1/10 of an ephah. Whatever an ephah is, okay? 2 quarts, okay? And I don't know, when I think it was like 6th grade, 7th grade, way back then, we had a course on the metric system because everything was going to be converting over to metric. And so we needed to know what the metric system is. And the metric system is based on 10. Everything's divided up into 10. And I didn't realize that the Israelites were part of that metric system because the omer is 1/10 of an ephah. There are 2 things that I want you to get out of these verses in Exodus 16. The first is God means what he says. To me, that is the underlying theme of the Old Testament, even down to a simple thing of not keeping manna overnight so you can have more the next day. This simple disobedient act was against God's law, and they failed. The second thing that I want you to glean out of this chapter is that the manna is what kept the children of Israel alive for 40 years. This simple little bread that God supplied to them every morning was their bread of life for 40 years. So when Jesus states in John 6 that I am the bread of life, the Jews who he is talking to recognize this phrase because God supplied the children of Israel this bread of life in the desert. Before we get to John, I want to look over at Luke 11 real quick. Now it came to pass, as Jesus was praying in a certain place, when he ceased, that one of his disciples said to him, Lord, teach us to pray, as John taught his disciples. Jesus proceeds to give an example of what a prayer is. And in verse 3, he says, give us day by day our daily bread. Some translations say, give us this day our daily bread. But we know here that Jesus is saying that this passage to the disciple, who is more than likely a Jew, to pray to God, to give each and every day the bread that we need. The bread that only you, dear God, can give us. Give us the nourishment that we need to sustain us daily. And Lord, give us more of this bread tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day. We can only get this life-sustaining bread from you. So what is this daily bread that for us as Christians? Let's turn over to John 6. I want to give the background story as to what has happened leading up to the verses. We're going to read that Jesus fed the 5,000. And he fed them with 5 loaves and 2 small fishes that they had taken from a small boy. And after doing this, in verse 15 of John 6, it states, therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. The disciples had taken a boat and were about 3 to 4 miles out, crossing the Sea of Galilee, when they saw Jesus walking across the water. And he caught up to the boat and got inside the boat, and immediately the boat appeared on the other bank of the Sea of Galilee. And then in John 6, starting in verse 26, Jesus answered them and said, most assuredly I say to you, you seek me. He's referring to the men that had come over from the other side of the sea, who was there when he fed the 5,000. They were just looking for something more to eat. And he told them, most assuredly I say to you, you seek me, not because you see the signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled. Do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set his seal on him. Jesus tells them not to seek the perishable food that they ate, and the food will last them not in eternity. Jesus is saying, seek after Jesus daily. Verse 32, dropping down to verse 32, Jesus said to them, most assuredly I say to you, Moses gave you the bread from heaven. No, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, sorry about that. but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. God gave the Israelites the manna in the wilderness, not Moses. But God has not given them but God has now given them a better bread from heaven, a bread that will give life to the world. In verse 34, then they said to him, Lord, give us this bread always. And Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. Do the terms of hunger and thirst sound familiar? Let's flip over to John 5 real quick. At the beginning of Christ's ministry, he performed what we call the Sermon on the Mount. And the first part of chapter 5, he gives what we call the Beatitudes. And in verse 6 of Matthew 5, he says, Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. We should hunger and thirst for what is right. God is the answer. We will never hunger or thirst again if we have Jesus in our life. We will be filled. Back to John 6. In verses 36 through 47, Jesus is rejected as the Messiah because he states that he came down from heaven. But those standing around know him as Jesus. They know his parents, Joseph and Mary. They say, how could he have come down from heaven when he was born here on this earth? Again, they do not understand what is going on. This term isn't new to them. They have studied about the children of Israel's trek through the desert their whole life. They knew exactly what Jesus is referring to when he says that I am the bread of life. Jesus is using a term or example that they would recognize and associate with. Verse 49, your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and are dead. This is the bread which comes down from heaven, that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread which comes down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I shall give is my flesh, which I shall give for the life of the world. I could see Jesus taking his hands and pointing to himself. I am the living bread. I am the living bread. It's me, the one standing in front of you. The manna in the wilderness that came down from heaven was supplied by God, not Moses. It gave life to those who ate it, but they have died. Jesus telling them that he too was sent by his Father in heaven to this earth. And he too is the bread of life. One may eat of this bread and not die, like his ancestors did. Then this conversation takes on kind of you might say, a creepy turn when people look at it who don't understand them exactly. And if we go back, I can imagine what those were thinking, when he starts talking to them, and they probably start backing up a little bit. Going to verse 48. I am the bread of life. I'm sorry. Let me back up again. I had a mistake in my notes there. The 5 loaves of bread that Jesus passed out to the 5,000 went on and on and on, and not only fed 5,000 people with the 5 loaves and 2 small fishes, but they were full. And at the end, they collected 12 baskets full of leftovers, just to show the power of Jesus, just to show his power. Because they were saying that, Lord, there's no way that we can feed this many people with just 4 pieces of bread and 2 fish. But not only did he feed them till they were full, but he fed them and they had leftovers. The manna that the Israelites ate in the desert was good for only one day, except for what they had collected on the 6th day. Jesus is the bread of eternal life. Those who partake of his bread are baptized into his body, will live forever. He offered his body to the cross freely so that we could live. Verse 52, the Jews therefore quarreled among themselves, saying, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? The Jews, of course, are getting stuck on their own rituals and the Jewish laws to where they could not eat a live animal or they could not drink blood. Of course, this is not what Jesus is referring to. We understand him to mean the bread and the fruit of the vine that we partake of, as we have just done recently. Jesus is talking about that, eating the bread and drinking the juice. These terms are foreign to them, so they don't understand them. It is like Jesus talking to French to them. At this point, it reminds me kind of the differences that we have in the British language and our language. They're both English, but we use terms that are different. When they say, bring me a torch, to us it's a stick with flame on the top of it. But to them, a torch is a flashlight. We say, go out and get something from the trunk. Well, to them, the back end of a car is a boot. So even though we're both speaking English, we're speaking in terms that we don't understand, across the pond. But Jesus is using terms here that they don't understand when he tells them to eat my body and to drink my blood. To them, that's like, hey, we can't do that as a Jew. These are terms that they're not familiar with. Jesus explains what he means in greater detail, but they are still confused. Eat my flesh and drink my blood. This is confusing to anybody outside of Christ. Dropping down to verse 55. For my flesh is food indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. Remember Matthew 5:6. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Verse 56. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood shall abide in me, and I in him. As the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so he who feeds on me will live because of me. No, this is not a physical eating and drinking of Jesus' body or blood that Jesus is talking about, but those who hunger and thirst for what is right and true and eternal. This is not what these Jews are searching for. They are searching for another physical meal. Then in verse 58, this is the bread which came down from heaven, not as your fathers ate the manna and are dead. He who eats this bread will live forever. These things he said in the synagogue as he taught in Capernaum. Therefore, many of his disciples, when they heard this, said, this is a hard saying. No, who can understand it? Yes, this is a hard saying, and one that is hard to understand for those who do not believe, and those who have not studied, and those who don't know the truth about Jesus. We must constantly hunger and thirst for his righteousness. Jesus asked his disciples in these next few verses if what he spoke had offended them. There were a few who left his side and never came back because of these verses that we have just read. They did not understand it. They thought it was wrong. And those disciples left and never came back. So Jesus turns to the apostles, or to the 12. And he asked them if they wanted to leave. And in verses 68 and 69, Peter answered, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Also, we have come to believe and know that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And in verse 70, Jesus answered them, did I not choose you, the 12, and one of you is a devil? Referring to Judas. So again, this was a hard subject. This was a hard topic and terminology that they did not understand. And his disciples didn't understand it. And the 12 might not have understood it, but it didn't matter. They were sticking with Jesus. They had no other place to go. But they believed who he was, that he was the Son of God. We studied together in Matthew 4, where Jesus was tempted by the devil. Jesus had fasted for 40 days, and Satan appeared at the perfect time, striking with a hot iron. Jesus hadn't eaten. And so what does Satan do? If you are the Son of God, take one of these rocks and turn it into bread. And Jesus replies by quoting Deuteronomy 8. We started this morning with the children of Israel starting their journey into the wilderness, and I think it is fitting that we end with them leaving the desert. Deuteronomy 8, verses 1 through 6. Every commandment which I command you today, you must be careful to observe, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land of which the Lord swore to your fathers. And ye shall remember that the Lord your God led you all these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you and to test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And we found out real quick that they did not keep his commandments because they tried to keep some of the manna 2 days. Verse 3, so he humbled you, allowed you to hunger and feed, and he fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone. And that's the verse that Jesus quoted to the devil. You shall not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. Your garments did not wear out. And in other verses, we see where their shoes, their sandals, did not wear out for 40 years. You'd be lucky today to get a pair of boots that last 6 months. But Jesus took care of them. He gave them everything. He gave them food. He gave them water. He gave them clothes that did not wear out. Nor did your feet swell these 40 years. You should know in your heart that as a man chastens his son, so the Lord your God chastens you. Therefore, you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God, to walk in his way and to fear him. Jesus is the bread of life, but he alone cannot save us. Just like a life vest sitting in your boat as you're going across the lake is not going to save you if your boat flips over. That life preserver needs to be on your body in order to save you. The children of Israel had to get up early every morning and collect their portion of manna to survive. The same is true with Jesus. You can't just say, I believe in Jesus, and not do anything to support that statement. In Matthew 7, verse 21, tells us that Jesus has said, not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, is going to enter into the kingdom of heaven, but those who do the will of my Father which is in heaven. You must live by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. We must keep the commandments of the Lord our God. We must walk in his ways, and we need to fear him, and we need to do his will. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. And he was the life to the Israelites, and he is the life to us. But we've got to accept what it is that we're told to do. We've got to keep his commandments daily. We've got to seek after his teachings daily. We've got to pray to him daily. We need to get that nourishment daily. Because otherwise, just as we saw in Matthew 4, the devil's going to be right there when we're our weakest. When we're our weakest, the devil's going to be there to try to snag us and to make us fall and to make us sin. And unfortunately, he succeeds. But we can't give in to that, can we? We can't say, well, I sinned, that's enough, I'll give up. No, we need to go back and look and search and get God back in our life on a daily basis. By doing that, we build up that wall, we build up that defense against the devil. We need to have Jesus as our bread for life. Sorry, I messed up a little bit on my terminology and reading my notes. That happens sometimes with my glasses. I'll use that as an excuse. But it's good to have you here this morning. If there's any way that we can help you in your walk, if you need the prayers of your brothers and sisters to help you with that walk, to keep the devil out of your life, let us know. Let us help you. Let us pray for you. As Glenn was mentioning this morning in the class, when he had his heart attack, a church 200 miles away was praying for him. We need those prayers. We need those prayers. If you haven't put Christ on in baptism, and that's something that you realize that you need to do, that you need to have Christ in your life so that he can be your bread daily. Let us help you. Let's take away that sin problem with baptism. Let us know what we can do for you this morning as together.